Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Melinda Haring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. We are here, there's 12 different think tanks and organizations, and we've joined forces today because we want to demonstrate our support for Ukraine, full stop. We believe in Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, and we're here to explore that with 12 different, very smart experts from all over Washington. Before we break into that discussion, I have two representatives who have given us remarks. I have Representative Brian Fitzpatrick, a Republican from Pennsylvania, and I have Representative Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat from Ohio, and they want to tell us more about why Ukraine's success is in the U.S. national interest. Let's go first to Representative Brian Fitzpatrick.
Hey everyone, Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick here, and I'm pleased to join the Atlantic Council virtually to discuss U.S. strategic interests in Ukraine. As a co-chair of the House Ukraine Caucus and ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Europe Subcommittee, a defining moment in the fight for democracy is upon us. This moment has not come as a surprise. Over the last 8 years, the good people of Ukraine have endured Russia's illegal and violent occupation. To date, some 14,000 innocent Ukrainians have perished, many of whom were civilians, with more than 1 million being displaced. The autocratic regime of Putin has engaged in countless humanitarian violations and challenged international norms of sovereignty over the last 30 years, and it is imperative that the United States and our NATO allies meet this moment with deterrence and diplomacy. America must stand up against Russian authoritarianism. The people of Ukraine share our Western values and deserve freedom from Russian oppression. The people of Ukraine share a steadfast commitment to regional cooperation, resisting polarization, and shining light on corruption. The United States has moved quickly to supply Ukraine with lethal aid to maintain its borders in the wake of increased Russian aggression. The United States has committed an additional $200 million in security aid, including anti-tank Javelin missiles and other military hardware, and we must encourage our NATO allies to act in a similar fashion. We applaud our NATO allies who have already stepped up to defend democracy, and it is my hope that more of our allied countries will also take charge and realize what is at stake. It is also my hope that our allies can look to decouple with Russia economically, recognizing the larger threat Putin's destabilizing regime poses throughout Europe. Taking decisive action and implementing economic sanctions is necessary, and we must weigh all of our options given the severity of this moment. Along with a wide bipartisan coalition, my colleagues in Congress have called for sweeping sanctions on kleptocrats that keep Putin's regime operable. As it has before with other rogue powers, the international community must take advantage of that dependence and send a clear message. If Russia insists on threatening the sovereignty of another state and jeopardizing global security, there will be severe economic consequences. In closing, I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for providing a forum to discuss these issues that are of grave importance to the United States and our transatlantic allies. Thank you for your partnership. Continue the fight. Know that you have a strong bipartisan coalition here supporting the work you do and standing unequivocally behind our friend and ally in Ukraine. God bless.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Representative Fitzpatrick, for those great remarks. I really admire Representative Fitzpatrick. He's been a great voice on Capitol Hill, especially on the anti-corruption fight in Ukraine. So next up, we have Representative Marcy Kaptur, a Democrat from Ohio and one of the co-chairs of the Ukraine Caucus.
Good afternoon, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important conference at this critical moment in time. As co-chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Ukraine Caucus, I have the honor of helping to steer Congress's policy and relationship with Ukraine, a valued friend and ally of the United States. 30 years ago, the people of Ukraine voted by more than 90% to establish their independence, an overwhelming mandate. Unfortunately, since that time, Ukraine has fallen under the long and dark shadow of those who wish to capture her back under their repressive command. I have visited Ukraine more than any other member of the United States Congress. I know her people, her communities, and her culture. In 2014, I visited Ukraine with then Vice President Joe Biden and the late Senator John McCain. The applause and cheers that rang forth from the crowd was palpable when the United States walked up the street. These freedom-loving people were exclaiming their love and friendship with our country. It was unforgettable. The people of Ukraine have hopes and dreams. They want to live with safety, stability, and prosperity. But those hopes and dreams face real and consistent threats to their liberty. Vladimir Putin is a tyrant who violently suppresses freedom and dissent within Russia and outside it. Over the last 8 years, nearly 14,000 Ukrainians have perished as a result of Russia's illegal invasion launched by Putin in 2014. More than 1 million others have been displaced. Putin is blocking Russia from attaining a better way of life itself, and thus he unleashes madness, bloodshed, and human misery in adjoining countries. What a tragic legacy. The Ukrainian people suffered unimaginable loss during the great conflicts of the 20th century. They know war and occupation. If Russia again invades Ukraine, the internal opposition would be fierce and bloody. The world must recognize the evil confronting it. If Putin were to succeed in clawing Ukraine back under Russia's control, his hostility would not end there. The response that is needed from global leaders is clear. When freedom and liberty fall under attack, the free world has an obligation to rise up in its defense. The United States, under the leadership of President Joe Biden, has been doing its part. The United Nations and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe have the ability to rally the global coalition to ward off Putin and his thirst for domination. So does NATO. Sanctions against Russia's oligarchy and the Nord Stream 2 pipeline must be stiffened. Energy independence in Europe must be secured. And a defensive shield for Ukraine must be forged. Russia cannot be allowed to operate as the outlaw on the European continent. The Russian people know life can be better. Let us seek to build, not destroy. Working together, we can safeguard liberty for Ukraine and her neighbors for all the generations to come. It is time for the world to act. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Kaptur, for those powerful remarks. We're really grateful that you could send that video. Now to the live part of our event. I have 11 fantastic experts, and I get to ask them questions. And if they are well-behaved and they only speak for up to 5 minutes, you too get to ask them a question. So please be brief. Ambassador Herbst is the Senior Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. He is the organizer of this event, and he is a former ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Herbst, why is support for Ukraine in U.S. national interests? The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, it's pretty simple. The Kremlin has pursued a revisionist foreign policy to overturn the international order established at the end of World War II and reinforced at the end of the Cold War. It is an attack on the principles of the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, and the Paris Charter. This order has underscored 30 years, exceptional years of peace, stability, and prosperity. Moscow attacked Georgia in 2008 and seized Crimea in 2014 and paid no price. We tried accommodating Kremlin aggression then, and it failed. It just led to more aggression. We began to push back when Moscow started the war in Donbass, and Moscow's covert war there has failed. It has failed in forcing Ukraine to give up its westward-oriented foreign policy. That's why he's now threatening a massive invasion now, as he's assembled over 130,000 troops on Ukraine's borders, unless his demands are met. Those demands are evident in the 2 draft treaties he sent to the US and to NATO in December. He calls for restored Russian influence, if not hegemony, not just over the former Soviet Union, but over Eastern Europe. This is a direct threat to our NATO allies and to our vital interest. So we have a vital interest in stopping Putin in place in Ukraine, a country fighting for its sovereignty. This can be done by placing additional heavy sanctions on Russia, providing more sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, and strengthening NATO's forces in the east. The buildup of Russian forces has led to a debate in the United States on American foreign policy. That's a good thing. Our contribution to the debate, or I should say our latest contribution to the debate is today's event. We can manage stopping Moscow in Ukraine without winding up in a fighting war with Russia. Russia is far weaker than the United States in all categories except nuclear weapons. We defeated Moscow's aggression and provocations during the Soviet period without winding up in a fighting war, a hot war with Moscow. We did it then. We can do it today with strong, steady policies. Those so-called realists who say we must bend to Moscow's will in Ukraine or find ourselves in a nuclear holocaust are paying no attention to what happened in the Cold War. We have, again, a vital interest which we can achieve via strength and without hot war in Ukraine. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, you heard it from John Herbst. He just threw the gauntlet down and said, realists, you don't know your Cold War history. I love it. Okay, we are on schedule. Dr. Leon Aron is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Aron, thank you for joining us. Go ahead and unmute. Here's your question. What are Putin's foreign policy objectives, and how does this crisis relate? The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this event. I'll be very brief. There are two overarching objectives to Putin's foreign policy. The recovery for Russia of the geopolitical assets lost in the Soviet collapse, and deploying the confrontation that with the West that such objective inevitably entails to bolster the popularity and his own popularity and thus his regime's legitimacy. Operationally, that means two things. It means establishing not territorial, but political control over former Soviet republics, meaning certainly control or veto power, perhaps, over their foreign and defense policies. But with some luck, he would not decline or recoil from controlling their domestic politics as well. The second operational issue here, in terms of implementation of those two goals, is degrading, weakening, and eventually eliminating the NATO structure and presence in the areas of the former Soviet Union and perhaps Eastern Europe. In all of those objectives, as you could see, Putin addresses himself to three audiences: the West, the former Soviet republics, now independent states, and very importantly for him, perhaps most importantly for him, his domestic audience. All of these audiences are present and addressed by the militarized drama that Putin is enacting on the Ukrainian border. So with respect to NATO, we know about the non-starters, the three demands, but there are other things that Putin successfully, I think, achieved. His refrain has always been, they're not listening, they don't hear. So here we are negotiating with Putin, perhaps on the moratorium on middle and short distance missiles, the exercises or maneuvers, military maneuvers by NATO and Russia, and perhaps reduction in NATO's high technology footprint, what Putin called the striking weapons. In doing so, we in fact legitimized Putin's fantasy of NATO's being on attack on Russia. And that brings me to his most important audience, which is, of course, his domestic audience. The domestic audience is served a totally different narrative through the monopolistic television. This is a defensive maneuver. Putin is defending Russia from a Ukraine that is egged on and armed by the United States to attack Crimea, Russia, or perhaps Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk. So with respect to his most important audience, I think Putin is gaining a great deal. Another success here, of course, is his sitting down or standing up with or sitting across the table from the one person that the Russians consider the most important in the world, and that is the American president, because for the Russians, there's ultimately only one country, and that is America. Every time, and that goes all the way to Stalin, every time a Russian or a Soviet leader is treated as equal by the American president. That's an enormous domestic political boost. Now, by the same token, however, that same audience will turn very sour very quickly if Putin invades Ukraine. They like Putin when he wins quickly and elegantly and with few casualties. None of that is going to be forthcoming after the first initial victory, after Russia begins the occupation. Ukrainians have shown themselves to be fierce and fearless guerrillas, both during the October Revolution and, of course, World War II. And the Russian public will not stand for the repetition of the Soviet Afghanistan quagmire. So that is why from the very beginning I said that there would be no invasion. Let me end on the third audience for this drama, and that is, of course, Ukraine. But Putin is addressing it indirectly. The goal here is to blackmail the West into forcing Ukraine to accept the so-called Minsk II agreements, which is essentially a capitulation that was negotiated while the Ukrainian troops were surrounded by the regular Russian troops in January of 2015. And in essence, it deprives Ukraine of territorial sovereignty by establishing two Russian protectorates on its territory. So this is where the general goals, the two overarching goals of Putin's foreign policy became operationalized. Thank you.
Super. Thank you, Dr. Aron. I wish we could have a debate. You laid out so many interesting points there. Maybe we'll get to it in the Q&A, but thanks a lot. That was really, really insightful. Next up is Herman Pirchner, who is the president of the American Foreign Policy Council, and he gets the best question. Herman, can you explain how a Russian land grab in Ukraine would damage the U.S.? I don't think that the links are necessarily obvious. It's obvious how it would damage the United States, but what does it mean for us?
The United States sends our senior officials abroad from the State Department, from the Defense Department, from the White House to protect and advance American interests. But their ability to do so successfully is highly dependent upon American credibility. To the extent American threats, American guarantees are not believed, our diplomats, our senior officials have a much harder time. Now, what are the things they confront, the people that and countries that are trying to work against U.S. interests? I think it's safe to say that there are many people in the world that wish the U.S. ill and are prepared to move against our interests. And let me flesh this idea out by talking about three countries in particular: Iran, Russia, and China. These three former empires and current empires look to expand their territory through the use of military force, and they're doing so today. And the hardest liners in those three countries will be emboldened by Russian victory in Ukraine. Now, what does that mean in practical terms? Perhaps in Iran, those hardliners have been calling for the assassination of American officials to revenge the assassination of Soleimani. Will get their way, and we'll start seeing American public figures be killed. Maybe it means Iran will move more aggressively against American allies in the Middle East. And what about Russia beyond Ukraine, beyond the countries of the former Soviet Union? Take a look at what's happening in Scandinavia. Russia has threatened the island territories of Sweden and Finland, and for that reason, they wish to join NATO now. Why is that important to U.S. interests? Because if those islands fall in part, even in part under Russian sway, it becomes very difficult to defend our NATO allies in the Balkans. It puts additional pressure on Poland. You have a similar situation with Denmark, whose island territory is also under threat from Russia. And then you have Norway. The northernmost territory of Norway is an archipelago, Svalbard. Russia has been challenging Norwegian sovereignty over that territory. That holds consequences for free passage of a newly opened merchant shipping through the Arctic, through the development of the continental shelf. Will Russia be emboldened to move against any of these territories if they have victory in Ukraine? Will their appetite be increased by the eating? And then you have the question of China. People think a lot about Taiwan, but how many people think about Russian or Chinese designs on Arunachal Pradesh? That's the northeastern India province, which Russia claims and is shown as Chinese territory on some Chinese official documents. What about Chinese claims on Sikkim, which is an Indian province between Nepal and Bhutan? And perhaps more importantly, with regard to the United States, what about the increasing Chinese activity in the second island chain in the Pacific? These islands for over 100 years have been deemed necessary for the defense of our West Coast, for the defense of Hawaii, and China now is making big inroads. What happens if China opens up a port in one of these small island countries and that commercial part suddenly becomes a military base? Will an island that has a population, a southern country, a population of 15,000, 30,000, be able to tell the Chinese to leave? No, they will not. So this is a story that could go on country by country for many hours. I want to close with looking at the flip side of this. If Putin is defeated, if Russia does not come out successful, that will also be a lesson to all those that wish the U.S. ill in the world. I'm reminded that Khrushchev fell from power 2 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he fell from power in part because the Politburo thought he was needlessly putting Soviet interests at risk. How about Putin's behavior? Is it risky enough that the 300 or 400 or whatever number of people that actually keep Putin in power collectively, how long before they think Putin's recklessness is putting their lifestyles in their mansions in Western Europe at risk? I don't know where that is, but there is a tipping point, and I think I've hit 5 minutes, so I'll stop.
Thank you. A lot of really great questions. Thanks a lot. Enjoyed that. Okay, next up, I have Dr. Paul Stronsky, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and he is going to explain. Paul, I just got back from Kiev, so I'm really curious to hear your take. Could you tell us, Putin has more than 130,000 troops surrounding Ukraine on 3 sides. How do the Ukrainians feel, and how does the rest of the region feel?
Well, I think, thank you for that question. And I think, Ukrainians are concerned. This is not the first time that Russia has used mighty force against one of its neighbors. And this is certainly not the first time Russia has done this against Ukraine itself. I'd like to go back to something that our 2 representatives from Congress mentioned. 14,000 people are already dead. 1 to 2 million people have been displaced. Lots of places to where these displaced people have moved. These are people who survived the initial war, families, young children, older, elderly, grandparents. They've moved to other places that are now very close to this new number of Russian troops. So there's a likelihood that we could see, these people become victimized yet again. We've talked a lot today already about the high geopolitics of what's happening now, but I just want to sort of highlight the human dimension of this, because the costs are going to be heavy if Putin goes to this. The costs are going to be heavy in human lives, both Ukrainian lives, but also Russian lives, and it's going to be heavy on the sort of migration issue as people have to get out of the way. That is going to impact the West in general. We're already facing migration challenges, but it's also going to impact the Ukrainian economy moving forward. I think what is clear is that the Ukrainian people, they've rejected a governing model that they've inherited, that the country inherited from the Soviet era. They made that clear during the Maidan. They've made that clear previously during elections in Ukraine. The war has alienated Ukrainians, including Russian-speaking Ukrainians. And the Russian propaganda against Ukraine, Ukrainians become a quite unified country despite all of its ethnic and linguistic issues. So I think the Russians don't have a good sense of what Ukraine is today, and I think that is deeply troubling. The Ukraine that I know has already had one peaceful change of power since the Maidan at the ballot box. It has worked on anti-corruption. It's worked on improving the rule of law, stabilizing the economy, and all of these, and improving the investor climate. All of this helped make Ukraine a much more economically vibrant place. But this current threats and the military buildup certainly put all of that under threat. Now, finally, there are countries around the world. Russia, claims that it wants to reinforce its privileged sphere of influence, or what it sees as this privileged sphere of influence. And I'll admit other countries have spheres of influence, but they generally exercise that influence through soft power, through economic power. They are generally more welcomed by their neighbors because they bring solutions. They bring economic drivers. But what Russia is doing, it's using its coercive toolkits to try and reinforce its influence here. And it's making clear not only to Ukrainians, but it's making clear to all of Ukrainians' neighbors and former members of the USSR that Russia wants and is willing to use and threaten force. That Russia wants a say not only in how these countries are governed internally, but also their foreign policy decision making. And I think that is a deeply worrying scenario. It is raising a lot of angst across the Caucasus, across Eastern Europe, and across Central Asia. And I think those countries are looking at what the West is doing to try to help support Ukraine as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. So many good points to chew on, but thank you for emphasizing the human drama in all of this. I really, really appreciate that. That's underappreciated. I know that the U.S. government is planning, is doing contingency planning about what happens to ordinary people. And I strongly encourage all the Western governments to be putting money aside just in case it goes there. Hopefully it won't. And your point on the economy in Ukraine is spot on. Everyone is so worried about what this means for the economy. And the government there is artificially propping up the economy. They're very upset that this is run the economy in the ground. So great points. Look forward to having a discussion at the end with you. Next up is Dr. Alina Polyakova. She's the president and CEO of CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, a great friend of the Atlantic Council. Alina, you get a hard question to do in 5 minutes. So the question is, what is the role of Europe in this crisis? Who's doing really well and who needs to step up their game?
Well, thanks so much, Melinda, and also John and the Atlantic Council for putting this really good conversation together. Well, I actually don't think it's a hard question to answer because clearly Europe faces the greatest military threat from Russia, direct military threat. It also has the most to lose from a renewed military conflict in Ukraine. From an economic dimension, Europe is deeply dependent overall on Russian gas imports. We all know that. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline has been a real thorn in the broader European and German U.S. relationship for a very long time for that reason. And of course, if there is, an invasion of Ukraine yet again by Russia that takes on a grander scale, we're going to see huge refugee flows from Ukraine to Europe. I think that is likely inevitable. So for all of those reasons, it should be on European allies to really do more to ensure that this kind of renewed military conflict does not happen on European soil again. It would be a disaster for European security. Unfortunately, what we have seen is recently some very public divisions between European allies. And what I believe Europe should be doing much more of is sending a message of unbreakable, unshakable unity with the United States and with NATO, rather than seeking different kinds of formats for cooperation or thinking about a separate security pact with Russia, as President Macron suggested at one point, that would have some sort of European negotiating arm without NATO, meaning without the United States involved. These kinds of other formats are not helpful. We need to present a united front. That united front must come from NATO. Now, specifically, what should European allies be doing? Well, clearly, security assistance should be a top priority. Some allies, of course, in the Baltic states, the UK, Poland, have actively been sending military support, security assistance of all kinds to Ukraine already. We should have been doing this on a much higher level as a transatlantic alliance since 2014, frankly. But it feels like it's a little too late. But hopefully, it's better late than never scenario. Clearly, Germany, France, some of the bigger European countries must also engage in the security assistance front. Of course, it's been very positive to see France, for example, commit to sending more NATO troops to Romania to secure the eastern flank. But this is really not enough. I think Germany really has a moment of self-reckoning to do regarding its policy vis-a-vis Russia and vis-a-vis Ukraine. Of course, Germany has a policy of not providing any kind of lethal aid, weapons, security assistance to so-called conflict zones. But I think there has to be a different policy when that conflict zone is just around the corner from your own border. I mean, it's a very different situation than a situation perhaps in the Middle East or Africa or elsewhere across the globe. So I think there are some serious moments of consideration that have to take place among the allies. And I think Germany in particular really has a choice for the new government. And it's really a choice between security and economic concerns. Unfortunately, the reality is that more so than any other country, Germany finds itself in this existential dependence on Russian energy imports, where the phasing out of nuclear energy, the phasing out of coal energy is basically leaving only Russian gas to fill that gap. Of course, there's an effort now to seek gas resources from elsewhere, but this is a huge problem. I cannot overstate how deeply, deeply important this is for understanding where Europe and especially Germany is on policy. So just to quickly sum up, the United States, I think, has led an incredible international effort to secure NATO support. We've deployed now 3,000 troops to the eastern flank. The NATO troops from the alliance should follow those US troops. There's no question about that. This cannot just be a US effort. It has to be a NATO effort. And allies have to step up. I think every single NATO member state should be contributing on security assistance. They should be contributing on humanitarian assistance. And of course, supporting Ukraine diplomatically and putting more pressure on Putin to not go this route. And in general, really wake up to the reality that we've been in crisis mode with Russia since 2008. And every time the Russians invade a country and interfere in our elections, kill people on our soil, as was the case with the UK, we seem to forgive them over and over again. It's really become kind of an abusive relationship in some ways. And yet again, we see European leaders now flocking to Moscow to meet with President Putin yet again. This is just lending more credibility to, I think, Putin's agenda. And we really have to stand together. And I hope that realization is coming to the fore now. I hope there is some serious rethinking happening in Berlin, in Paris, but the message has to be clear. It's unity. It's an undivided stance. This is what I think really scares Russia. When he sees an alliance, when Putin sees an alliance that is standing united and that is not going to budge on our key principles. And that is where we need to be heading, and we need to be following, I think, the US lead on this, because in the last weeks, they've done a very good job getting all the pieces in place, and now it's up to the Europeans to pick up the pace.
Amen, Alina. Well, thank you so much. That was absolutely perfect. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Andrea Kendall-Taylor. She is a senior fellow and director of the Transatlantic Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She couldn't be here today, but she's one of our proud sponsors. Mr. Jonathan Katz, you are up next. Jonathan Katz is a senior fellow and director of the Democracy Initiatives at the German Marshall Fund. And Jonathan is he's worked at AID, he's worked at the Hill, so he's perfect for this question. Jonathan, how can the US and its partners support Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I just thank you, the Atlantic Council, to you and John for putting this together. And then also just for this really great show on the think tank community and expert community. I think standing together with Ukraine and for this challenge is incredibly important. And also to get bipartisan participation really is important. And that goes to some of the heart of what I would discuss today. And I wanted to also join in. A number of you have praised the administration's efforts so far, the Biden administration, to bring together a coalition, the transatlantic community, the EU, NATO. It's been a challenge. There are some issues that were on the table previously this year that have challenged the transatlantic relationship. And so I think where they are today and the overtime effort that they've made has been critically important. I want to start with the question that you asked, Melinda. And since you were just in Ukraine as well, and I'm sure you heard an earful, not just on the military support, but also on sort of the other needs that Ukraine has. And so I just wanted to talk about that. I served in the Obama administration in 2014. And the one thing that we saw then that I hope to see today in terms of support for Ukraine is a surge in assistance and greater assistance. You couldn't have two better members of Congress starting off this conversation, including appropriators, talking about the needs for Ukraine. Now, 100%, we're in the middle of a security situation right now where Ukraine needs military support. I think the 7th or 8th plane load of military assistance has arrived most recently in Ukraine, and that's critically important. Intelligence, other security support is critical. But we should be really focusing on, when we look at this, is a surge in overall assistance and funding in multiple areas that are needed for Ukraine. And when we're talking today, we're also on the precipice of the fiscal year 22 budget possibly being passed. So this is important to those Hill colleagues who are listening in and thinking through funding. So the United States needs to think a little bit more deeply about surging funding and support in multiple areas. Of course, we need to focus on the sovereignty and territorial integrity issues, military security intelligence, which I mentioned, but we also need to think more about what Melinda spoke about too, which is these economic needs and challenges facing the Zelensky government, the Ukrainian people. And I want to just highlight, I think has been some movement forward over the last several days where the EU has offered additional macroeconomic assistance, I think 1.2 billion euros. President Biden, in his conversation with President Zelensky, used the word additional macroeconomic assistance. When we look back over the last 8 years in assistance, the United States has provided roughly $4 billion in assistance. That has included 3 $1 billion loan guarantees that were critical in 2014 when Ukraine was facing a similar type of economic crisis. My hope is that as U.S. policymakers, as the EU work with international financial institutions, that we will see a similar type effort and assistance package to ensure that Ukraine, which is facing economic challenges, knows that it will have, over an extended period, additional macroeconomic assistance to weather a really difficult storm. This isn't something that's new for Ukraine, as has been discussed, but it's something that is widely needed. So we should need to be thinking about other areas of assistance as well. I mentioned the $4 billion in assistance. The areas that I'd like to see the United States, and this is also for transatlantic partners as well, is increased levels of support for countering aggression, particularly in countering disinformation. We haven't talked too much about it today, may have come up, but this has really been a deep challenge for Ukraine. Though they have tremendous amount of experience in countering disinformation, that support continues to be needed. But also, frankly, the US and allies and partners need to do a better job at countering disinformation. And I've heard from a number of colleagues and partners across Europe who see the type of disinformation. We can go into what's being said. I don't think we need to do that for this audience. But in this instance, the United States and partners are still significantly outmatched by Russian propaganda, both in Ukraine and globally. And this has a disproportionate impact on how populations and governments, including in Europe and in the United States, respond to what's taking place. And I'm afraid to say some of that challenge exists in the United States, including in mainstream media that we're seeing, picking up on Mr. Putin's propaganda, his positions. And I think that's dangerous both for the United States and our security, but it also impacts our politics at home in a way at a time when we need to have strong bipartisan support. I would also point to the need for additional humanitarian assistance. Melinda, something you pointed out, sort of looking at The United States has been providing humanitarian assistance as part of a UN and global effort since 2014 to Ukraine. I'm still struck when I look at the numbers that the State Department and USAID have up on their website. 3.4 million estimated Ukrainians requiring humanitarian assistance today, still. Hundreds of thousands of IDPs in Ukraine still in need of support. 1.9 million Ukrainians targeted for who need additional humanitarian assistance or health interventions. It's extraordinary. So if you can only think about what a significant intervention in Ukraine might look like and what the needs are. So pre-planning ahead, it's true. We know that USAID and others are looking at these, at what's needed. We saw a new fund, which was launched just yesterday by the United States, Sweden, Canada, the Swiss government, and the UK, which is focused on strengthening a resilient Ukraine, but it's focused on the communities in Eastern Ukraine that are most vulnerable to both disinformation, economic aggression, energy aggression. So humanitarian assistance is critical. We see the US putting funding and support in that direction. Human rights support will also be needed. And we also talked a little bit, and I don't want to go too deep into this, I hope there's some questions, both cybersecurity, which is a major concern, but also I wanted to point out the need for energy security. And we see all those as part of the discussions right now. I'm just going to turn it over to, the ball is in Congress's court over the next couple of weeks to increase that funding level, but it also is in the court of partners and allies, not only to support Ukraine, but to increase resources and support, not only in Ukraine, but also in Eastern Europe and those countries that are impacted by Russian aggression. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I really appreciate that in-depth advice. And Jonathan is your man, or if you work on Capitol Hill, as you're thinking about budgets, he's happy to work with staffers, and he understands all the deadlines and all the details. So do reach out to us, and I'll be glad to put you in touch with Jonathan. Jonathan, I do have one rejoinder to you. You said that it's time for the U.S. to step up our assistance to counter the Russians. Yes, but it's not just a matter of money. Right now, the United States is not fighting back, and it's bureaucratic inertia. The White House is controlling things, and the State Department does not want to empower certain parts of the government that it has already to counter these bad messages. So we need to clear out the bureaucratic cobwebs and do it. So that would be my counter to you. But unfortunately, we have to move on and move to the next speaker. My next speaker is Dr. Emily Channell-Justice, a good friend of ours from Harvard. She is the director of the Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at Harvard University. Emily, you have 5 minutes. This is another challenging one. What should U.S. and Western policy toward Ukraine be? The floor is yours, Emily.
Thanks so much, Melinda, and thanks to everybody who's given their time to talk about this important issue today. In 2014, I stood at the center of Kyiv along with thousands of other Ukrainians to mourn the deaths of 100 protesters at the hands of Viktor Yanukovych's pro-Russian military police. Those protesters gave their lives so that Ukrainians could make a choice about their future. Since 2014, Ukraine's future orientation has been about establishing a strong democracy and participating in a European and global economy. It has been an imperfect effort, to be sure, but it's going in the right direction. So the United States must work to support this effort in Ukraine, and this means a strong response to Russian threats. US and Western policy toward Ukraine need to be based on a recognition of Ukraine's fundamental right to national territorial sovereignty. There must be bipartisan support of this basic principle, and the United States needs to enter any negotiations with this foundation. Russia first violated Ukraine's sovereignty when it annexed the Crimean Peninsula in 2014. Russia first supported separatist demands in eastern Ukraine, and it has continued to sow discord in the east through occupation, through troops on the ground, misinformation, and more recently, the illegal distribution of Russian passports to people living in the occupied territories. The United States and its global allies did not respond strongly enough to the annexation of Crimea and the occupation of the eastern territories in 2014, and that has helped to lay the groundwork for the current crisis. So first, and I think most importantly, Ukraine's Western allies cannot concede to Russia's demand to promise that Ukraine will never join NATO. NATO must stand strong in its open door policy, and the US must help encourage Ukraine to meet the standards expected of a NATO member. So this means not only continuing to aid Ukraine's military, building capacity, building ability, but that also means encouraging Ukraine's economic and political development. The US has to support Ukraine's efforts to fight corruption from within, because a well-functioning Ukrainian democracy will be a strong participant in NATO and in the global economy. If the Ukrainian democracy is allowed to fall apart, then Russian claims over its territory become more difficult to contest. So this is a threat that democracies around the world need to take seriously. It's not an over-exaggeration. Furthermore, Ukrainian support for joining NATO has never been higher. So it's important that NATO member states recognize this big shift in Ukrainian political opinion and reward the work that Ukraine has done in building its democracy in order to reinforce Ukraine's Western-looking future. Secondly, the US must seriously consider the role of economic sanctions that would most effectively prevent a Russian incursion of any kind into Ukraine. This includes preemptive sanctions and also sanctions in response to the completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. These have to be under consideration. Vladimir Putin may easily see the possibility of future sanctions as an empty threat, and he's also likely to consider to push the line to see how far he can get without a definitive response from the United States and other Western governments. But we also know that Putin's popularity in Russia is nowhere near as high as it was in 2014. We know that the Russian economy is slowing down. Economic sanctions on those in power in Russia, and even those types of sanctions that would have a negative impact more broadly in Russian society, these could do significant damage to Putin and therefore on his ability to make claims on Ukraine. I think it's also really important to think, as part of our figuring out what the best policy needs to be, if Putin gets concessions from the United States and other Western powers, he will ask for more. He claimed territory from Ukraine in 2014, and also the year 2008 was mentioned. He claimed territory in 2008, and yet again, we're faced with a threat that he will claim more territory. So without a strong response from the United States, Putin will continue to make more demands, and he'll continue to threaten Ukraine and other sovereign states in order to get them. The United States and Ukraine's Western allies need to present a strong, united front against Russian aggression. They need to make it clear that they support Ukraine's democratic future and that they will not accept Russia's violation of Ukrainian territorial sovereignty. They need to make sure that Ukraine has a seat at the table in the negotiations about Ukraine. So even if those who are already part of the discussion disagree with President Zelensky's assessment of the situation, maybe they disagree with his demands, but he must be included in the discussions about Ukraine's future. And the United States fundamentally must support Ukraine so that Ukrainians can decide their own future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emily. That was wonderful. My next speaker is Luke Coffey. And Luke, I have been waiting and waiting for this part of the program. Luke is going to destroy all of the myths. There are many myths out there that say that America has no interest in Ukraine. It's really far away. We have plenty of our own problems. What are we doing mucking around in another foreign country? So Luke is the director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Luke, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Melinda. And I want to also thank John and your fantastic team at the Atlantic Council for putting together this superb event. Before I start discussing myths, I just want to reiterate what was already said and just remind our audience that it was Russia that invaded Ukraine in 2014 and not the other way around. Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine is the victim. And it's not the other way around. It's not Ukraine that has 130,000 troops around Russia's borders. It's Russia that has 130,000 troops around Ukraine's borders. And we shouldn't forget this fundamental fact on who is the aggressor and who is the victim here. And a lot that ties into a lot of these myths I'm going to discuss. Now, I think there are four main myths that need quickly debunking. The first one is that if U.S. troops are sent to Europe, they're going to be there to fight Russians. And this also you hear this also being said as, why should we be going to the Ukrainian border to fight Russia when we leave our southern border wide open? Now, the debate about the southern border could be a whole nother conference, and I won't address that here. But what's dangerous about this myth is that there are people with primetime TV slots with an audience of millions of people who listen to this nonsense, and they really believe that U.S. troops going to Europe will be there to fight Russia. The reality is quite the opposite. I've never met a Ukrainian policymaker or a Ukrainian official or even any serious commentator or politician here in Washington who actually suggests that the U.S. should deploy troops to Ukraine to fight Russia and to defend the Ukrainians against Russian aggression. The main focus of these troop deployments, of course, will be living up to our treaty obligations under NATO, and they will be based in NATO countries in Eastern Europe. And we shouldn't forget that the world is not black and white. It's not that we have engagement or isolation. It's not that we surge our forces or we withdraw our forces. The alternative to deploying the 82nd Airborne Division to liberate Crimea isn't to do nothing at all. There's a huge policy space in between these two extremes. That's where we need to be today. And we've heard a lot of great ideas on this. Now, in terms of the second myth, this is about the idea that this is really all about NATO enlargement, or as people like to say, NATO expansion, which I hate the word expansion. I prefer enlargement, and that we're encroaching on Russia's sphere of influence. This is, again, is a complete nonsense. In 2013, when the Maidan really kicked off, this was about a trade deal, an association agreement with the European Union. It wasn't even about NATO enlargement. NATO enlargement over the past 17 years has progressed at a snail's pace. In the past 17 years, 4 countries have joined the alliance. Of these 4 countries, they have the territorial size of about North Carolina and the population of about New York City. And the closest one is about 900 miles from the Russian border. And nobody in recent years have seriously suggested that Ukraine is going to join the alliance anytime soon. So this isn't about NATO enlargement. This is much bigger. This is Russia's imperial view of its role in the region and in the world. The third myth is about this idea that because of the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, we cannot deploy US or NATO forces to Eastern Europe. The NATO-Russia Founding Act in this context, in this debate, must be one of the most quoted but least read documents. In fact, what the document says, and I'll quote here, in the current and foreseeable security environment, then the US and NATO won't deploy permanent bases in Central and Eastern Europe. This document is a quarter of a century old. It is 2 Russian invasions old. And we've seen a whole catalog of Russian aggression against Europe and NATO since this agreement. And then the final point, and I'll conclude here, is this myth that we need to really get along with Russia because we need them for China. And again, it really takes a special amount of geopolitical ineptitude to really think that this is a possibility for the US and for the West. And there are 3 reasons why. The first and the obvious one is that Putin cannot be trusted. Even if we wanted to come to some sort of accommodation with Russia to deal with China, nothing since coming to power in 1999 has shown us that Putin can be a trustworthy partner. And in fact, he has done everything he could to undermine our interests since 1999. The second is the Russian economy is now intimately linked and connected to the Chinese economy because of the pressure we have placed through economic sanctions on Russia. Just last year, between the 2 countries, there was about $150 billion in trade. This was up 36% from the year before. By 2024, they want to have about $200 billion turnover in trade. And this year, they're hoping to ink the agreement for the Power of Siberia natural gas pipeline, the second Power of Siberia 2. We hear of Nord Stream 2. There's a Power of Siberia 2, which will deliver even more natural gas from Russia to the Chinese market. Russia's not going to do anything to disrupt this. And then the final point on why Russia can't be used against China is that Russia sees itself first and foremost as a European country. And Vladimir Putin has a to-do list in Central and Eastern Europe, and it's not going to jeopardize that to-do list by this idea that they can team up with the West against Russia. It's complete nonsense. Anyway, I'll stop there, Melinda. Thank you again for having me on to speak today, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Luke. And I really appreciate you giving our team a shout out. Our team busted their butts to put this together. And I really want to give a big shout out to Doug Klain, Adrienne Hofer, Andrew Denary, and Shelby Maggid. You guys do amazing work. And the fact that you put this together so quickly with so many complicated pieces, hats off, guys. Thank you. Luke, if you haven't written up that presentation, you really should. That was so clear and perfect. Thank you. Really appreciate that. And we need you out in the media making that pitch over and over again. Next up is Glen Howard. He's the president of the Jamestown Foundation. Hi, Glen. Can you talk a little bit? So if Russia does go in, invasion, incursion, how strong will the resistance be? Your thoughts on that? Go ahead, please.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Melinda, for inviting me to be here today and speak. And also thank you to Ambassador Herbst for putting this together. Greetings to all my colleagues. First of all, I'd like to point out that many of my remarks today are based upon an op-ed that I published in The Hill that came out earlier today about providing the need to provide Stingers air defense weaponry to Ukraine as it's urgently needed. First of all, my arguments kind of echo off a little bit of what Luke says, but Ukraine, first of all, is not Georgia. It's a population of 45 million. It's not a population of 3 million. It's the size of France, twice as big as Germany. Its military forces are 250,000 men with a 145,000 man army that's currently deployed against the Russian forces along most of its border. So the Russian army itself has about 280,000 ground forces. But when we talk about Ukraine, we need to keep in mind they've got 450,000 veterans who have served in Donbass and have military service and are not currently serving. So this is a vast manpower reserve that Ukraine can tap into, which really strengthens the argument that Ukraine doesn't need U.S. ground forces to defend itself. What it needs is technology. So with most of its forces deployed in Donbass, Ukraine faces what I call a Russian boat constrictor that's constantly being squeezed from the north, south, and east, and it faces a very much wide multi-direction threat. So Ukraine experts believe that if Russia did come from any one of these directions, they would need at least a 3-1 military advantage fighting on the defensive against the Russians. And so this would do a lot to kind of tie down Russian forces, and they would need a lot of more force than they currently have. So the idea in defending itself is Ukraine is trying to turn itself into basically use Mao's maxim about the army swims with the people. And that is what Ukraine is trying to do now. It started in May 2021 by enacting territorial defense reforms that it has started to implement. And sadly, it only just started implementing these recently. President Zelensky said that they would be increasing the size of the Ukrainian army by 100,000 men over the next 3 years. So that would rapidly give another large infusion of manpower into its forces. So the biggest thing for Ukraine is this technology factor because it lacks in military technology and sophisticated equipment. And so this makes it harder for Ukraine kind of to plan and defend itself. But what is ending up making the difference, and I made the argument in my Hill article, is that Ukraine now has 1,000 javelins. These are state-of-the-art weapons in the U.S. military inventory that we've given to Ukraine. This will do a lot in nullifying the Russian take advantage when and if it comes. So technology is a multiplier, and Moscow will be using something called the correlation of forces when it sits down and calculates its losses if it goes into Ukraine. So the United States and Ukraine are changing that and have changed it with the transfer of the javelins, and the British government is also changing that with the arrival of the in-laws, which are short-range anti-tank weapons that have a 600-meter range. These weapons are now in abundance in Ukrainian forces, and they will nullify any type of Russian effort to go in urban fighting in urban terrains. And so the combination of these weapons is going to make a big factor in what Ukraine has. Now, as I point out in my article, the key and the weakest links is the defense of Kyiv. As we saw in the 2008 war with Georgia, the Russians will target the capital. Now, there's anybody's guess on where this attack will come, and the problem with Ukraine is going to be trying to figure out where that attack would come. But my argument is that attack through the swamps of Belarus on the border, which dominate most of the Belarus-Ukrainian border, is pretty much is unlikely because of this very factor of the terrain and making it very difficult. But the most likely avenue would be what they call the Kiev-Cherniv axis, which is basically from the Bryansk region of Russia, and that faces the Ukrainian border, and in front of the Russians is the Kiev-Cherniv Autobahn. Now, I'm sure Ambassador Herbst has driven down this road many times. It's 139 kilometers, 4 lanes, and you get there in a very quick amount of time. But the highway is flanked by heavy forests, and it makes a perfect killing zone for Russian tanks and could be Putin's highway of death, just like the Iraqi army faced in Kuwait in 1991 when they lost over 2,000 vehicles. So the Ukraine's javelin hunting forces could stop the Russian attack head on, but Moscow has the advantage in air power, and they could attack the units hiding, using the force along the Autobahn with their attack helicopters, and they could take out a lot of the advantages of the javelin hunting teams that would be there. So my argument is that if we give Ukraine and help it with the transfer of the Stingers, the man pads, that would really nullify the Russian advantage. And Lithuania and Latvia both stepped forward to send their older version of Stingers to Ukraine. And these are helpful, but Ukraine needs the more modern version of the Stingers. And so this would go into Moscow's correlation of forces and make it a big stopping factor. And in fact, it could be a deterrent already in effect, but just because Moscow knows that they have the Stingers, they know that they can scratch off that column in terms of their air dominance over Ukraine. So I'll end my talk with the following couple of recommendations. First of all is the air defense. They need the Stingers. They need it immediately. It could turn the battlefield in Ukraine the same way it turned the battlefield in Afghanistan when we drove the Soviets out. My second point is that Ukraine has manpower. It doesn't have a shortage of forces. It needs technology, but it also needs the command and control systems that the United States can provide with its intelligence. Ukraine, biggest challenge is figuring out where and if an attack comes, where will be the blow. They can't figure that out. It's going to be a big challenge to them, but we can do it with our intelligence. The third and last point I'd like to make is an airlift. Ukraine has had the image on our televisions of getting air assistance and planes arriving. We need to be doing this every 2 days. You know, I'd put tomatoes on those C-130s. I don't care what's in it, but as long as these planes are showing up every 2 days, it keeps Moscow guessing. And it's a form of deterrence because once Moscow calculates all of these estimated weapons loads arriving, it will start thinking and scratching their head, well, maybe it's not such a good idea. So Melinda, John, thank you very much for letting me speak today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Glenn. That was so helpful. I really appreciate those comments. And folks, if you haven't had a chance, just go down to the chat. Doug put up his Hill article and you can have a look at his argument in more depth. I have two more wonderful speakers. I have Admiral James Foggo, and Admiral Foggo, everyone's worried about the Black Sea. So I know you're going to explain to us what we should be worrying about. Admiral Foggo is a retired admiral. He's the Dean of the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Naval League of the United States. Admiral Foggo, it's a pleasure to have you here. The floor is yours, sir. And you are muted. There you are.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Melinda, and thank you, Ambassador Herbst, and to the Atlantic Council and the Eurasia Center for inviting me. So it's great to give a maritime perspective from the brand new Center for Maritime Strategy where I sit here today. And I'll have to tell you, though, that what we're seeing in the maritime is nothing new. It's been the boiling frog scenario for a long time. I want to take you back to the incident in 1986, where the United States of America sent the USS Yorktown in to do a freedom of navigation exercise along the waters of Crimea, Ukraine. Now, we're equal opportunity fawners. We do it to our allies and our adversaries. And in this case, it was an adversary. That ship was met by the Soviet frigate Bezzavatny. And for a long time, there was shadowing until the Bezzavatny came up alongside Yorktown and collided with her and raked her side and did a lot of damage to both ships. You can actually see this on Google on a video today. And it reminds me of something out of the Hunt for Red October. Curiously enough, both those commanding officers were promoted to Rear Admiral, and I worked for one of them later on. So we actually used to reward behavior like that. Well, after 1989, the fall of the Soviet Union, there was no peace dividend. There was no end of history, according to Francis Fukuyama. And after a short respite, we started to see things that are a lot more difficult in a multipolar world. And with Vladimir Putin as president of the Russian Federation, we were surprised by the invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the Russification of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. And under the Obama administration, we all remember that there was a reset, the famous pushing of the button between Secretary of State Clinton and Foreign Minister Lavrov, curiously enough, also still here or there today, and a new period of détente reigned in. Now, Russia made a debut in the Olympic Games of 2014. At the time, the Sixth Fleet, I was Sixth Fleet commander immediately after this time, Phil Davidson was there. We actually had the command ship USS Mount Whitney and one of our expeditionary patrol frigates in the Black Sea, and we had communications with the Black Sea Fleet commander. But after the Olympics and Maidan and the illegal annexation of Ukraine, all that came to a full stop. Of course, we pursued diplomacy through Minsk Accords and the Normandy Agreement because we were in a frozen conflict in Donbass and Luhansk, but that has not worked yet. I hope it does, but I'm not holding out, any hope that it will. Now, Russia completed its Kerch Bridge project in 2016. It's interesting because the Sea of Azov really doesn't come under NATO jurisdiction. It's a treaty between the Russian Federation and the Ukraine from 2004, before the illegal annexation of Ukraine, but they're bound by it. And Russia has taken almost total control of that body of water. They are strangling the Ukrainian economy in the port of Mariupol through that total control. And it is completely unfair and egregious. After the completion of the Kerch Bridge and some of the measures that were taken to restrict traffic into the Sea of Azov, Ukraine bravely pushed back. I knew Admiral Voronchenko when he was CNO, and he alluded to the fact that they were going to do something, and they did. They sent 3 ships in there, 2 patrol craft, 1 tug. They were immediately met by the Russian Federal Security Bureau. The tug was rammed. They put a hole in it. They fired on those ships. They seized those ships. They took 27 or 28 crew members wearing a uniform, arrested them, charged them as criminals, and sent them to a prison in Moscow where they spent 2 years before they were released. That's outrageous. That's a violation of the Geneva Convention. But we didn't do enough about it. I sent a couple of ships in there when I was 6th Fleet Commander, but we didn't have the holistic NATO and the whole of government approach from the United States. And I think that's regrettable. Now, we did build up to greater sized exercise and participation and collaboration, trying to rebuild the Ukrainian Navy after these incidents. In fact, last year, my successor did the largest sea breeze exercise ever. I was really proud of that. I was over there for 9 years, never seen anything that big. But you recall that the Russians, or somebody, spoofed the AIS and GPS systems to put a couple of ghost contacts off the port of Sevastopol. That is, it may seem small or funny, but that is very dangerous conduct. Ghost ships can cause wars. Think Gulf of Tonkin. Now, more recently, President Putin has amassed up to 140,000 troops on the borders of Ukraine. The collective response of the alliance has been one of the better ones that I've seen in my 39-and-a-half-year career. I retired last year, but it's a land-centric response, and that is insufficient and unsatisfying to me. In December of 2021, we had 3 ships, 3 American ships in the Black Sea. Again, the USS Mount Whitney, the command ship, USS Arleigh Burke, the destroyer, USS Porter, the destroyer. Since then, a NATO presence of NATO navies in the Black Sea, absent the presence of Romania and Bulgaria, has been diminished. The government of Denmark has agreed to send a ship to the Black Sea. They punch above their weight class, and Spain is talking about it too. But we need more maritime force, and we need more Navy, because this is not just a land campaign. So it leads me to conclude the following things. Here's the beef. We don't have a comprehensive NATO maritime strategy to deal with situations like this. I've said this for a long time. Number 2, in the past, when a crisis like this occurs in a body of water in the NATO maritime area of responsibility, we're compelled to run to the sound of the guns rather than having robust plans that are flexible and anticipate a response to a crisis in advance. Frankly, the third conclusion is, whether it's NATO or the United States, we just don't have enough Navy to make points 1 and 2 work. And so, in my opinion, the North Atlantic Council must address these issues in the defense and foreign ministerials leading up to the Madrid summit this summer and articulate a plan that addresses maritime shortfalls, particularly in support of our allies and partners, Ukraine and Georgia included, in the Black Sea, and put that into the next NATO strategy that was alluded to in NATO 2030 strategic review in November 2021. Thanks so much for the opportunity to contribute. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Admiral Foggo, and thank you for your service. Okay, last but not least, we have Dr. Donald Jensen, a good friend of ours from USIP. He's the director for Russia and Europe. Hi, Don. You get You get the last question. Okay, so what are Putin's foreign policy objectives, and how does this crisis play into that? The floor is yours, Don.
Well, thanks, Melinda. Thank you, John. Thanks to your team, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about Putin's goals. Some of you in the audience with eagle eyes may notice that Dr. Aron one of my most distinguished friends, has the same question. So let me bring up a couple other points to maybe fill out the discussion. I also apologize because Americans are supposed to end up on optimistic notes. So let me end up on a more sober note and turn to Melinda and John for the optimism. We are obviously at a dangerous time. There's nothing more dangerous than an ambiguous, unorganized peace, or what Leon Trotsky once said. Leon was born in Ukraine, by the way, no war, no peace. So I think we have to be very careful. We have to be very clear-eyed. We have to be very sober about what's going on and in devising our response. So first, what does Putin want? Well, I do not think he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. If you doubt that, go back and read his July article of last year. It's still on the presidential website. He wants to build, in my view, the Russian imperial empire in its modern form. That includes the kasha of a strategic culture made up of traditional Russian imperial views, a Soviet legacy indeed, but also it's enabled by high technology, unprecedented during the Cold War. And second, I would argue that the dominance of the Siloviki in the leadership makes a huge difference in devising what Russia does, what it pursues, and what it wants. Well, what does it want? Number one, of course, it wants to subjugate Ukraine. We've talked a lot about that today, but it also wants to rewrite the European security architecture, which we see how the Kremlin has leveraged what was a dispute over one country into a much broader challenge. I would also argue that it still wants to upend the international system, which it falsely believes victimized Russia in the 1990s. Okay, so some cautions. Number one, there is no guarantee that even if we have a deal on de-escalation now, the crisis really will go away. I think it will just take other forms. Number two, I think we are about to see a considerable tightening of the screws at home. And I think there are actually probably some people around Putin who welcome tougher sanctions. It shows their machismo. And I refer you to my friend Ivan Kostev's article in the New York Times yesterday. And I think under no circumstances will Putin, the Kremlin, and the current leadership let Ukraine go over the longer term if they can help it. And it's our job, of course, to make sure that they can't. Some cautions. Number one, I would remind everybody that this is a multi-domain struggle. The fruit buildup was combined with attempted coups, provocations, bomb threats in the subways of Kiev, and I think this will continue. Number two, caution number two, would be that I think the leadership in the Kremlin is more or less drunk on being aggressive. This is no longer the Saakashvili's Kremlin. It's one that's been enabled partly by, I think, Western slowness to respond. And they're going to pick fights. They're going to pick fights wherever they can, even if we have a de-escalation, even if we have a settlement over Donbass, and so forth and so forth. Excuse me. So what do we have to be alert of? We have to look down the path a little bit. We have to see what's next, and what next is not necessarily going to be a military invasion. It's going to be something else, and it's going to be something else perhaps at a different target. It's going to be, I don't like the word hybrid warfare. I know Glen Howard doesn't like that term either, a multidimensional warhead. And that's what we've got to prepare ourselves for now, the longer term. They are not going to give up Ukraine anytime soon. They are not going to loosen the controls in a way that they perceive would threaten their own rule, and they're not going to reach understanding with the United States over the negotiating table that they see will diminish their ability to project power in the world. So I think I'm slightly under your 5 minutes, Alina, Melinda and John, but I think we have to be very serious about what we're dealing with here. And I think we have to get less wrapped up in the daily ins and outs of some of the details we've been talking about. This is it's not a clash of civilizations, but it's a clash of strategic cultures. And I think sometimes we let our guard down, and I, like the others, welcome the energetic response of the Biden administration and our NATO allies in this past few weeks in particular.
Thank you so much, Don. I think you need to be the closer at more of our events. Well done. That summarized, that captures everything. I'd like to thank our audience today for your patience. We had many, many speakers. Thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Thank you to our technical team. It was wonderful to be with you. Keep your eye on our events. Thank you for your attention and have a wonderful weekend. And hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar. Goodbye.